Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this Orinoco Tribune interview. Joining myself and Dana from Orinoco Tribune today, we have Pitasanna Shanmugathas, co-director of the excellent documentary film series Truth to the Powerless, an investigation into Canada's foreign policy. We're going to speak a bit about the film itself and about Canada's foreign policy today. Pitasanna has a master's degree in global affairs from the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and has worked in multiple organizations advocating for peace and disarmament, such as Save the Children, Science for Peace, Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, and Stand Canada. While completing his postgraduate education at the University of Toronto, Pitasanna decided to embark on a 3-year documentary journey starting in 2019 to explore Canada's foreign policy. I wanted to ask you first, Pita, about your inspiration for making this series of documentary films. What motivated you to do that in the first place?
Yeah, and thank you for having me, first of all, to speak about my docuseries. It's a long story. Initially, when I was going to school, you kind of learn about Canada as being this peacekeeping nation, that Lester B. Pearson, Canada's former prime minister, he had intervened in the Suez crisis and really introduced peacekeeping to the world. And so we're very benevolent. And that's kind of the education that you get. And you kind of get criticism about Canada's policies with respect to Indigenous people. You're taught that in school now, which is nice, but I don't think it goes far enough. But that's, as far as criticism, that's kind of where it ends, really. So that was what I was taught in school. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a work by a writer by the name of Yves Zengler, and he had written an article about Lester B. Pearson. I was sitting in the airport and I just was just going through my social media feed. I stumbled upon this article by Yves Zengler, and it was about Lester B. Pearson, about how he had supported the Vietnam War and how he had been a key ally in forming the state of Israel, and been supportive of dispossessing Palestinians. So this was like a revelation, and that kind of began this journey, of me just going through Yves Zengler's work. I then, came upon the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, which is which just kind of blew my mind open. And that was my first critical exposure to Canada's foreign policy in a very, anti-militaristic light, which kind of exposed Canada's horrendous atrocities. The idea to actually do a documentary would come years later. I stumbled upon a documentary called The Sellout of East Timor, and it was done by a filmmaker by the name of Elaine Briere, and it was released in 1996. And this was like the first, as far as I know, the first Canadian foreign policy documentary that really looked at an element of Canada's foreign policy in a critical light, in a critical anti-militarist light. And then I came across another documentary by a filmmaker by the name of Amy Miller, and it was called Myths for Profit. And it also looked at Canada's foreign policy in a more broader scope, in a very anti-militaristic light. So I looked at these two documentaries, and these two documentaries were anti-militarist, but they were only interviewing activists and dissidents of Canada's foreign policy. They weren't really interviewing, they never interviewed the politicians responsible for formulating and advocating and championing and executing Canada's foreign policy. So it was at that moment that I thought, hey, wouldn't it be a cool idea if there was like a documentary that interviewed the politicians responsible for formulating Canada's foreign policy and executing and championing it, as well as the activists and dissidents that are challenging that foreign policy. So you would get both sides of the picture. That's when the idea first came to me. I'd become friends with a filmmaker by the name of Ryan Ellis, who had been in the film industry for quite some time. And one day he just asked me, do you have any ideas like to do like any sort of film or project or like documentary? And I was like, yeah, I kind of have this idea about, doing a documentary in Canada's foreign policy. So I pitched it to him, and then this was in 2019, in April of 2019. And then from there, we just just began interviewing academics and activists and politicians. So that's where the journey kind of began.
Great. Dana's going to ask you in a bit a few questions about Canada pertaining particularly to their relationship with apartheid Israel. First, I wanted to ask you what your experience has been since you made the film in terms of promoting it, and I think maybe particularly considering the algorithms on social media and the fact, that you're promoting a film that is critical of Canada's foreign policy. What kind of avenues have you seen opened or closed to you because of the contents of your film?
The mainstream Canadian media has just totally ignored this. My project partner Ryan, he was friends with a journalist at the CBC who had actually expressed an interest in our, he watched our docuseries and he loved it, and he wrote an article and he submitted it for review at the CBC to be published, and then they refused to publish it, and they didn't give any reason as to why. So that's just one instance of the case where the mainstream media just kind of ignored our docuseries, and so that's that. And it's not surprising because we challenge, we're critical of the mainstream media in our docuseries and the way that they shape, Canada's foreign policy, the narrative behind that, and how they justify intervention. So that's not surprising. We've also we've received a lot of support from peace organizations. Our film was screened by the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. A lot of activists have been sharing our docuseries, so we've received a lot of support there. And really, social media has been our friend in this regard through promoting on, Facebook and Twitter, and all these, peace groups are promoting it on their email networks. And so in that sense, social media has been our friend in that regard.
Very nice, thank you. I would like to thank you for your docu-series. I mean, being someone who was born in Canada and living abroad, Canada definitely has this reputation, or kind of this image of being like a peacekeeping nation or whatever you want to call it. So I think it's really important that we challenge this narrative, and your documentary can definitely do that. So something that I'm kind of watching really closely, and something that we're watching from Orinoco in general, is what's happening with apartheid Israel. And so I wanted to ask you how you think that Canada's relationship with the Zionist state today compares to its relationship with South Africa towards the end of its apartheid regime. So you mentioned how in 1986, Canada imposes sanctions on the apartheid South African regime. And what do you think it would take for Canada to impose sanctions like that, or to even stop or impede the sale of arms to them? And also comparing Justin Trudeau to Brian Mulroney, it seems Mulroney was one who are willing to take a stand against apartheid, even though he belonged to a more conservative government. Do you think this is reflective of the Liberal Party in general, or of Canada's position as a global power on the whole? And lastly, I don't know if you can speak to this, but if there's any progress or effort you're seeing in any Canadian political parties that are willing to take a stance, a more harsh stance against apartheid Israel.
Yeah, so I'll kind of answer the last question first. With respect to some progress that Canadian political parties have made, the most noticeable progress has kind of been the NDP under Jagmeet Singh, where we discussed this in our docuseries, actually, for the first time in Canadian history. The NDP, the leader of the NDP, called out Justin Trudeau in Parliament and said, you need to halt arms sales to Israel so long as it continues its illegal occupation, its settlement building activities. So that was a significant, shift, because prior to this, and Jagmeet Singh has put out a policy outline of, this is where the NDP stands. We condemn, Israel's settlement activities. We need to halt arms sales to Israel, and he's put out a more substantive, a hard line. Previously, when he had first became leader, he was a fairly staunch supporter of Israel. Like he would have to be bombarded by activists, outside, Palestinian activists to say you need to call out the state of Israel, and just leading up, until Israel's fairly recent assault. He's been a strong supporter of Israel. So this was like a significant shift. So that's probably the most noticeable change of a Canadian political party really, speaking out against Israel. But that came, there's like a huge, years and years of history behind Jagmeet Singh, the NDP party shift on this issue. That took years and years of at the NDP headquarters convention trying to put resolutions which were, for some reason or other, rejected, or they wouldn't be tabled. So that took a long time for this to finally happen. And he's getting a lot of pushback, but for the most part, Jagmeet Singh he's holding his ground for the most part, as far as I know. In terms of South Africa and Brian Mulroney, that kind of came as a result of like years and years of organized resistance on the part of Canadians that were targeting, South African businesses, that were targeting Canadian businesses that were doing investment in South Africa, exploiting the black labor force, the cheap black labor force in South Africa. So the organized opposition in that case was so strong, and you had seen a pattern of our neighbor in the U.S., our neighbor in the United States was they had organized, mobilized resistance where across the spectrum in the United States society, black and white people were rallying and calling for the West to impose sanctions, strong sanctions, compelling the apartheid government to release Nelson Mandela and really bring democracy to South Africa. Even when Brian Mulroney imposed sanctions on South Africa, the sanctions were actually far less strong than the sanctions that the United States and other European countries imposed. For instance, we still maintain diplomatic relations with South Africa. We still did $1 billion in trade with South Africa after we had imposed the sanctions. So our sanctions were far weaker than the United States sanctions against South Africa, which were very strong because you had the Congressional Black Caucus, you had all these huge black leaders that were really pressing the United States government to take a hard stance against South Africa. And Ronald Reagan was a racist who was opposed strongly to sanctions against South Africa, and he had to his veto was overridden by both chambers of Congress. In the case of Israel, in the case of South Africa, we can make the comparison that South Africa, they needed their cheap black labor force because that was an economic engine. In the case of Israel, the Palestinians are completely useless to them. They just would prefer that they kind of just disappear, and that's the main contrast. Where in the case of apartheid South Africa, the cheap black labor force was a useful economic engine where foreign companies would invest to exploit this black labor force. That's not the case in Israel, where it's the Palestinians are kind of just a nuisance there, and they just need to be gotten rid of from the perspective of Israel. In both cases, the reason why Canada supported apartheid Israel and the reason why Canada supported apartheid South Africa is because they're settler colonial nations that were premised on suppressing, subjugating, getting rid of the indigenous population. And Canada was founded on suppressing the indigenous population, expelling the indigenous population. In fact, in the case of South Africa, we discussed this in the docuseries, South African officials came to Canada and looked at our residential schools as a model that they can emulate in the way that they govern their apartheid structure in South Africa. In the case of how we can actually build resistance to finally compel Justin Trudeau to impose sanctions on Israel, to halt arms sales, that will have to result in even greater mobilization, even greater pressure from the Canadian public. You know, in the case of Israel, Israel uses this tool of anti-Semitism. Anytime you have a leader that kind of, you know, comes up, we saw this with Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, just baseless criticisms of anti-Semitism. We're kind of seeing it with Jagmeet Singh a little bit. And so they use that as an effective, a potent tool to stifle any criticism of Israel's actions. So I think it just has to result in a fever pitch of mobilized opposition within Canada, to the point where Canadian political leaders across the spectrum would just have to say, okay, this situation is untenable. We can no longer support Israel's occupation. And you know, Israel is now increasingly going in an even more hard right direction with Prime Minister Netanyahu's re-election and the coalition that he'll have to form. You know, so it's really tough to say what will happen.
That's great. As our viewers know, Orinoco Tribune is a Caracas-based English language media outlet. Each of the 6 parts of the documentary is on a different topic: South Africa, Israel, and there's one that speaks about Latin America and Haiti specifically. I wanted to maybe you could provide a little bit of a background on Canada's foreign policy towards Venezuela. A lot of viewers might not be aware of that, and maybe you could speak just a little bit about the really topical events in terms of the newly elected governments that were formerly part of the Lima Group, which has been described as being a Canada-led operation to overthrow the democratically elected government of Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, so the Lima Group is kind of premised on creating a peaceful resolution to the economic crisis in Venezuela. That's like the premise of the Lima Group, but really it's just like a cover to oust Nicolas Maduro from power, painted in like flowery language, so Canada has been at the forefront of trying to, of backing up Juan Guaido to replace Nicolas Maduro as the leader of Venezuela. Canada has held several meetings, bringing all these Latin American countries, like Chile, for example, but it's become largely a failure. Canada hasn't been successful, and the reason why Canada is backing Juan Guaido is because Canada wants a Venezuela that will be more receptive to like mining interests. They'll be more receptive to Canadian and other Western-led companies exploiting Venezuela for its resources. And Nicolas Maduro is opposed to that, and Canada's opposition to Venezuela, it dates back to Hugo Chavez, who the Canadian establishment just branded as a dictator and a thug. And even though he had enormous popularity among the people, and once Venezuela had encountered its economic crisis, which was supported and backed by the West through sanctions. Canada has imposed sanctions on Venezuela. Canada has, within the Lima Group, has sought to refer Venezuela to the International Criminal Court to face, under Maduro, to face charges for its alleged human rights abuses. So Canada is very much exploited and is responsible partly for Venezuela's economic troubles. And Venezuela, Hugo Chavez had also made a mistake in the sense that he didn't diversify Venezuela's economic resources. I think Venezuela was too dependent on oil, and that really hurt them. So when Nicolas Maduro came in, and the global markets weren't that favorable, it resulted in a climate and an atmosphere which was supported by US-led sanctions that really hurt Venezuela. But many countries Peru has now expressed opposition to the Lima Group. So it's the Lima Group without the Lima in it. So many other countries have since. We see now with Brazil we have Lula coming back. With in countries like Bolivia, in countries like we have left-wing governments that are kind of coming back. People are saying it could be like a resurgence of like a pink tide. I don't know, but I don't think they're going to be successful. And now with the crisis in Russia intervening in Ukraine, and how that's affected European oil supplies, and a lot of people are kind of looking towards Venezuela. And there was a recent meeting between Nicolas Maduro and Emmanuel Macron, where Emmanuel Macron kind of expressed interest of, we need to repair our relationship. And that may have been a very, strategic move, perhaps, of trying to get Nicolas Maduro to bring oil to Europe because of these Western US-led sanctions against Russia. So, I think it's been largely a failure. I don't, yes.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Thanks. I wanted to ask you also about Canada's role in Haiti, where they played a large role in I believe it was the 2004 overthrow of democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and also Canada's role in the core group. Haiti's been in the news a lot lately, obviously, with the possibility of a renewed military intervention by the US, as they're trying to get international support for that. What is Canada's role in these current events regarding Haiti?
Yes, our docuseries looks at Canada's involvement in Haiti in overthrowing, dismantling democracy there. So we interview the politicians that were responsible for the 2004 intervention in Haiti. We interview the foreign affairs minister, the defense minister. We interview the U.S. On the U.S. side. We interview Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell. And so we get the establishment narrative, and we also get the narrative from activists and the Haitian dissidents. So in that case, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he was a democratically elected, he was a Catholic priest. He had a strong resonance among the poor people of Haiti. He wanted to uplift Haiti so that it could become a dignified, it could become a country that was dignified to a degree, poverty with dignity. That was kind of like a slogan that Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his party, the Lavalas party, kind of embodied. They just wanted to improve the living standards of the Haitian people, increase the minimum wage. Under Aristide, when he was president, they had increased the minimum wage. They had significantly tackled the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the country. They had dismantled the ruthless Haitian military, which was organized and trained and set up by the United States, and that was causing horrendous atrocities. They had, there were more schools built during the Lavalas administration than any other time in Haitian Haitian history, really. So they were doing all of these initiatives that were really strongly supporting the poor people of Haiti. And this was creating a sense of animosity within the US and within Canada. In the case of Canada, Canada is the largest blank T-shirt making company in the world, Gilded and Activewear. They're in Haiti, and when Aristide increased the minimum wage in Haiti, this was strongly opposed by Canadian business interests. And the real threat was that it's the threat of of a bad example. So if a poor, impoverished country like Haiti can improve its standard of living and can give health care to its people, can give education to its people, that then threatens other countries like that are subservient to U.S. interests, like Mexico and Honduras and all these other countries. So it then creates a potential domino effect. So that was the real reason behind the fact that Aristide had to be overthrown. And what was probably another trigger to that reason of why Aristide had to be overthrown is because he was calling for France, Haiti's former colonial occupier, to pay reparations to Haiti, because what France did was, in exchange for Haiti becoming free, the first Black republic, first free Black-led republic in the world, France said, you have to pay us back for the slaves that we're going to lose. In essence, the Haitians had to pay for their freedom. And Aristide had calculated the amount of debt which Haiti had paid, which had severely bankrupted its economy. Aristide had calculated several billions of dollars, and France, while Aristide was president, he said that France, you have to pay back our debt so we can invest in our people, and so that we can become a growing, flourishing country. And and France was opposed to it. So that was kind of the trigger. And now there have been a New York Times did an article where France, diplomats within France said the ousting of Aristide provided relief to France, and now there will be no serious pressure for us to actually pay reparations or pay any debt. So that was, there were a multitude of reasons, but that was basically why Canada and the U.S. and France and other countries had intervened. And when I had interviewed Bill Graham, who was the foreign affairs minister at the time, he did not express any remorse for his actions at the time. And it was a very tense interview that I did. Like the tension in the room was so thick, like he could cut it with a knife. It was an extremely tense interview because he did not anticipate that I would grill him essentially on what he did in Haiti, but he expressed no remorse. And when the interview was done, he told me off camera, like, do you have any idea what we did to try to get that man out of Haiti? Because Canada had secured the airport, and so that Jean-Bertrand Aristide and his wife could be kidnapped onto a plane and flown out of the country. So Bill Graham's mindset was, well, we did Aristide a huge favor. We saved his life. He should be thanking us. That was his mindset. So there was no regret on the part of Canada. And what we're seeing now is, Jovenel Moïse, who was the Haitian leader who had been supposedly elected, but with less than like 20% of the vote. I think it was like 18%. It was a fraudulent election. He was elected, and he had sought to remain in power, wouldn't call for another election, so he was assassinated. There's been a lot of rumors that it was like Western backed or something. Like it's a lot of that is very unclear, and there's been rumors that it was like neighboring countries or forces and gangs from neighboring countries. So a lot of that is unclear, but he was assassinated because he wanted to remain in power, but he was a dictatorial leader who did not represent the interests of Haitians. The Aristide's party, the Lavalas party, has been significantly weakened since Aristide was ousted. He's back in Haiti now, Aristide, but he can no longer be president of the country. Due to like constitutional limits, he's already become president twice, so he can't become president again. And so once Moise was assassinated, you had a leader come in Haiti named Ariel Henry, who did not, once again, represent he was a Western-backed leader who was put in place once Moise was assassinated, and he did not have the best interests of Haitians. He was strongly subservient to U.S. and Canadian-led interests. He had withdrew subsidies for the gas and oil sector, which had resulted in significant increase in prices, and so gangs came out in opposition to this, and the Haitian population came out in opposition to this. It was Western-backed nations that were pushing for the subsidies to be lifted. And when Ariel Henry did that, there was huge opposition. So the framing of the opposition by the Canadian government has been that, once again, these are gangs that are kind of coming into Haiti, in Haiti. They're roaming the streets in Haiti. They're massacring and killing people. So Canada, along with the US and Western countries, are once again trying to push the narrative that Haiti is in trouble. Haiti needs to be saved. And but the Haitian people are saying that this is our problem. We require an indigenous solution, which does not, where UN forces should not be involved. And so a lot of Haitians are kind of trying to rally and mobilize Russia and China to veto any UN Security Council resolution that's trying to authorize intervention into Haiti. So that's kind of where things are, and it's really just a sad repeat of history of where Western countries feel the need to deny agency to the Haitian people and prevent them from running their own country.
Great, Dana's going to. Before we get to your last question, an important question, Dana, I wanted to ask just quickly what about a topic that you didn't cover in your film, which is about Canada's role in Ukraine. What have you learned recently about Canada's involvement in the Ukraine conflict?
We actually cover it a little bit towards the end of our discussion on NATO's intervention in Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia, and Libya. Towards the end of it, we actually the Monk School was holding an event, and it featured like John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt and a Polish politician. It featured a U.S. politician as well within the U.S. I believe it was the State Department, discussing whether NATO was actually at fault in the reason as to why Putin has decided to intervene in Ukraine, and we show excerpts of the debate that the Monk School had. We interview people who were going to be in attendance of the debate, Canadian citizens. We asked them what they think as to why Putin has decided to intervene in Ukraine, whether NATO was at fault, and you get a regurgitation of the establishment line where people believe that Putin is trying to resurrect the Soviet empire, and this is just empire building on the part of Putin, and that because that's what the media is saying. So that's what the Canadian people are regurgitating. So we show very compelling arguments made by individuals like Mearsheimer, which shows that the fact that the United States and the West at large was constantly pushing for Ukraine and Georgia and really pushing for expansion of NATO right up to Russia's border, that this was strongly opposed by Russia, strongly opposed by Putin, and this was a reneging of an agreement that was made in the towards the end of the Cold War between Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east, and that's the continued expansion of NATO, the continued intervention of Western forces in Ukraine is strongly, extremely provocative, and that is a significant reason as to why Putin has invaded Ukraine. Of course, it provides no justification. The invasion is horrendous and it's atrocious. That there's no justification for it, but that's the reasoning for it. And the fact that Canada is opposed to any diplomatic, calling for any diplomatic solution to the current crisis. Canada and the United States are both opposed to it because the rationale is that we want this intervention to go on as long as possible so that Russia could be internally weakened as much as it possibly can. And that's a horrendous strategy because it's resulting in more and more Ukrainians losing their lives. So that's what the media, the Canadian media, won't cover. So we show towards the end of our discussion of NATO, the legacy of NATO. We talk about Russia, Ukraine, and we interview Canadians. We show segments of the Monk debate, both sides of really debating this issue. And we kind of leave it there. A discussion of NATO is, this is the legacy of NATO. This is what, politicians that we interview, like James Bissett, who was Canada's ambassador to Yugoslavia. This is what James Bissett was warning about, that Canada's continued expansion, Canada's support for NATO's expansion eastward, that this is going to trigger Russia to respond dangerously. And that's precisely what happened. And
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so just to take it back a bit, so I noticed in the episode about Haiti, how we kind of saw the highest level of contradiction between what the politicians said or what the defenders of Canadian policy said and what some activists and more on the ground people said. So that leads me to my next question. So you interview writers whose work Orinoco Tribune has published, such as Justin Podur, Yves Engler, and Tyler Shipley, but you also choose to interview defenders of Canada's foreign policy, such as former Minister of Defense Bill Graham and others. So why did you choose to do this, and why do you think they were receptive to being interviewed by your team?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we wanted a docuseries, a documentary on Canadian foreign policy that kind of showed both sides of the issue. Really, that showed Canadian the arguments by Canadian politicians for their reasoning, the rationale for their foreign policies in these various different conflicts, these various different countries. So we wanted that argument, but we also then wanted the perspective of Canadian activists and dissidents who are challenging that narrative, because the narrative that these politicians are presenting is a largely benevolent narrative. When we talked about Canada's intervention in Libya, Canada's intervention in Yugoslavia, Canada's intervention in Afghanistan, the politicians that we interview, they largely portray the rationale for their interventions as being humanitarian and being good-natured interventions. We had to do it, and that has been the viewpoint echoed by the mainstream media. So we wanted to challenge that as well. So we wanted to get dissidents and activists that would then respond to that. So we wanted both sides of the issue so that it could be a really educational docuseries, so that people don't accuse us of only showing one side of the issue and not really seriously considering the full spectrum of the complexity that is Canada's foreign policy. Why politicians were so receptive? We had a lot of these politicians we interviewed are actually retired politicians, so we would they were in consultancy or something, in that field. So we just email them or email their offices and just tell them we want to do a documentary on Canada's foreign policy, and we want to show this documentary, show multiple perspectives of this documentary. And we wanted to talk with you about your time in government, and a lot of them were just I guess receptive to being interviewed. I mean, you know, sometimes if you ask somebody, you'll be surprised that they'll actually say yes to something. So, you know, and we gave them the talking points in advance. We gave them the main questions in advance. Follow-up questions we asked like on the spot, but they knew what the subject matter would be, and they agreed to being interviewed. Largely, actually, I never challenged any of the politicians with one exception, really. All of the politicians, I let them speak the establishment line. So when I interviewed David Pratt, the Minister of Defense, when I interviewed John Allen, Canada's ambassador to Israel, when I interviewed Dennis Horwath, Canada's last ambassador to Saudi Arabia, when we interviewed all, you know, those kind of politicians, we just let them speak the establishment line. So because we wanted to get that out of them. And so then we would then interview activists and dissidents who would then challenge that establishment line. The only exception is Bill Graham, where, you know, I just felt, having been a student at U of T, having known Bill Graham personally at the Monk School, Global Affairs, you know, Bill Graham was a presence there. I knew him personally. I just felt that we had actually been trying to get that interview for 1.5 years. He was going through some health issues. He was going to die. And I felt that, you know, he was such a revered figure within U of T. He has this whole institution of global affairs within the U of T just named after him. So I just felt, you know, this guy's going to die and nobody's really going to grill him or question him seriously about his involvement in Haiti, you know, his involvement in Afghanistan. And, you know, I was like, I felt really compelled because I knew I'd probably be the last person to interview him, or one of the last. And I think I was. He died a few days after this docuseries was released. So I just really felt compelled. I have to challenge this guy. We have to break from our practices of what we did with the previous politicians, and you know, it provided for a very uncomfortable atmosphere. He did not he did not like the challenging questions that we were asking him, and he didn't have any remorse for what he did in Haiti. Some remorse actually for what he did in Afghanistan, a little bit. You can actually see that in the docuseries, because I asked him, you know, straight out, you know, so many refugees were created, so many, you know, civilians were killed. You know, in retrospect, should Canada have not intervened? And he just pauses, very reflective, and he's like, I can't answer that. So you can see some remorse there. On Haiti, there was no remorse at all. He had genuinely believed everything that he did in Haiti. He believed that, you know, he was responding to oust a thuggish leader who the population did not like, who had encouraged rebels to roam the streets and cause chaos. That was the essential pretext. And when the interview was over, he was kind of. He told me this. He said that one day he was walking down the street, and a bunch of Canadians came and started heckling him and said, "You're a war criminal for what you did in Haiti. You know, you're a war criminal." And his face, as he was telling the story, he looked very pained. Like, you know, he's like, "I'm not a war criminal. I didn't do anything. You know, I didn't do anything bad in Haiti." That's how he felt. So he did not have any remorse. So the main narrative, the narrative of this docuseries is Truth to the Powerless, where the powerful, Noam Chomsky, in the very beginning of the docuseries, says, you know, the powerful already know the truth. It's the powerless that don't. That was the main narrative that we were operating on. So we'd interview the politicians who we felt knew the real truth about Canada's foreign policy, but they were just saying the lie. And then we'd interview the activists and academics who would challenge that lie, that narrative. But really, when I interviewed Bill Graham, it was kind of like, especially once he died, I reflected, and I felt that he genuinely thought, maybe he didn't know the truth. He was powerful, but he didn't know the truth. He genuinely believed what he did was a good thing. And once I came to that realization, it was kind of, you know, it was kind of disheartening a little bit, because I felt sorry for him, because he genuinely believed what he did was a good thing. And I would have felt better if he if he knew it wasn't a good thing, but was just feeding me BS, then it would be like, but I felt sorry. And it was something once he had died, I really reflected on this.
Well, it's really
Yeah.
interesting.
There was one other closing question, Dana, that you had.
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to fit that one in. Yeah, so just speaking in general, I feel like so obviously there's like an issue of too many Western powers like trying to intervene under like complete lies, like saying that they want to like help the people. Meanwhile, their interests are completely different. But there's also times where maybe we complain that they're not doing enough to stop certain injustices, which maybe they can and they're not doing and they should do. So just kind of a general question for us to think about. But do you think that like intervention or Western intervention is the answer to stop injustices, or would it be more suited to keep our discourse more within neutrality and non-intervention?
Yeah, we actually discussed this issue in our docuseries when we talk about the responsibility to protect doctrine, and how Canada was kind of at the forefront of, and we interviewed politicians like Canada's former ambassador to the United Nations, Paul Heinbecker, and Bill Graham speaks about this, the role that Canada played in formulating this doctrine of the responsibility to protect. And the doctrine was very duplicitous in the sense that you had kind of, as Noam Chomsky explained in the docuseries, you had like a UN version of the responsibility to protect, and then you had like a NATO version of the responsibility to protect, where in the case of interventions, like in Libya, publicly leaders like in the United States and Canada would appeal to the UN version, but privately they had their own NATO version of the responsibility to protect, where they would use NATO as the force that would go into the country, but then publicly appeal to the UN. So we exposed the responsibility to protect doctrine as being very duplicitous. And in the case of Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen, there isn't really any call by Canada and the United States for a responsibility to protect there, because Canada is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which we talk about in the docuseries when we interview Canada's ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And Canada has financial economic interests there. So Canada doesn't really have an incentive to really criticize Saudi Arabia's atrocities in Yemen. So there isn't really a responsibility to protect there, or there isn't a responsibility to protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza that are in the West Bank, that are being met with Israeli atrocities and violence because Canada sells arms to Israel. Canada at the UN consistently supports Israel's occupation, settlement activities, votes against resolutions, which overwhelmingly more than 100 countries support, that are critical of Israel's occupation. So there's no responsibility to protect there, but there's responsibility to protect in the case of countries like Libya, where there's a leader who's opposed to Canada's interests, who's using his resources to help the Libyan people have a comfortable, economic lifestyle, good education, good healthcare. He's established a nation where it's setting a negative example, that is antithetical to the interests of Western-led Western corporations that see countries that have such resources like Libya as a potential ground for economic exploitation. So in that case, that's where we apply responsibility to protect. So this whole nature of Western intervention, it's a very duplicitous affair where you only intervene where it suits your interests, where there's something that you can exploit, or where there's a leader that isn't following Western-led orders. So and that's basically what we uncover in this docuseries.
It's really informative. I wanted to thank you first and foremost for making this documentary series. I think everyone should check it out. This series can be viewed at truthtothepowerless.com. I wanted to thank you, obviously, for your time today also, and for speaking very knowledgeably about these matters. Anyone who's checking out and enjoying that series, it was a nonprofit documentary. If anyone's ever made films, they know how expensive that can be. So we encourage anyone who wants to support it to donate through the website. Again, that's truthtothepowerless.com. There's a donate button there on the website that anyone could find. So again, thanks to all our viewers, and you can find us all at orinocotribune.com. Thanks for your continued support.
Thank you.